the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's talk on how LA is getting hotter and drier with longer fire seasons and what to do about it. Throughout 2018, the Hammer Museum and the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge have been exploring the technology, infrastructure, and ideas that can make Los Angeles the first entirely sustainable megacity in the United States. We call this series Future LA: Engineering a Sustainable Supercity. Every month in 2018, we've been discussing one specific arena, such as building a sustainable energy grid, mobility and the future of transportation, and what the built environment is going to look like as our population grows. And tonight is the final program in the series. So I really want to thank our wonderful colleague, Asma Mahdi, who's done most of the work in putting together these fantastic panels. Where's Asma? Shout out to Asma. Woo! She's awesome and brilliant. Tonight we're going to look towards the future. Climate change is happening, and we need to figure out how Los Angeles will adapt to the hotter, drier summers and winters. We can expect even longer fire seasons in our future and increasingly poor air quality. So researchers at UCLA, as well as in our local Los Angeles city and county governments, are now taking steps towards designing healthier communities by setting ambitious sustainability targets. Mark Gold is our moderator tonight, and he'll start tonight's program by presenting a quick overview of the issues. Then our panelists will each give a brief presentation here at the podium, and then they'll all sit down for a discussion with Mark Gold, and at the end we'll take audience questions. Our first panelist is George Ban-Weiss, Assistant Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at USC. George is an assistant Prior to joining USC in 2013, George was a scientist in the Heat Island Group and Climate Science Department at the United States Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. George's research uses numerical models in concert with field observations to investigate air pollution, climate, and land cover change, ranging from the neighborhood level to global scale. He has over 40 publications in scientific journals, funded in part by the National Science Foundation, the California Energy Commission, and the California Air Resources Board. George also received the National Science Foundation Early Career Award and the American Geophysical Union Global Environmental Change Early Career Award, both in 2018. Next, we'll hear from Jisung Park, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at UCLA. Park holds joint appointments in the Department of Public Policy at the Luskin School of Public Affairs and the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at Fielding School of Public Health. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University, where he was a National Science Fellow and specialized in environmental economics, labor economics, and public finance. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Columbia and master's degrees in environmental change and management and in development economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar from 2009 to 2011. Our third panelist is Lauren Faber O'Connor, the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Los Angeles. Part of her role there is to drive the implementation of LA's Sustainable City Plan, released in April 2015, which puts forth an actionable vision for transforming LA's environment, economy, and equity. Prior to joining Mayor Garcetti's administration, Lauren was the West Coast Political Director for the Environmental Defense Fund, where she won support on innovative approaches to protecting and promoting climate, clean energy, land, water, and wildlife. In 2010, she was appointed to the California Environmental Protection Agency, where she worked on the design and implementation of California's landmark Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32. Prior to that, she was Senior Director for Lighthouse Consulting Group in Washington, D.C., where she advised on comprehensive national climate change and energy strategies for domestic and international companies and NGOs like the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. She's on the board of the California League of Conservation Voters and the U.S. Department of State Energy Advisory Board. And finally, our moderator this evening is Mark Gold. He formerly served as president of the environmental group Heal the Bay, which is dedicated to making Southern California coastal waters and watersheds safe, healthy, and clean. Mark has worked extensively over the last 20 years in the field of coastal protection and water pollution. He received his bachelor's and master's in biology and his doctorate in environmental science and engineering from UCLA, and he was recently appointed UCLA's Associate Vice Chancellor for Environment and Sustainability. So now please join me in welcoming Mark Gold.
Thanks for coming tonight. I'll be very brief. This has been an extraordinary series, really looking at the megacity of Los Angeles and its 10 million people and the various different environment and sustainability issues that the region faces. It's part of the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, which has been this big focus of UCLA. And with the audacious goals of doing research that would really help inform what would it take to get the megacity of Los Angeles to 100% renewable energy, 100% local water, an enhanced ecosystem, and human health. And so we're about 4 years into that program. There's about 45 different research projects involving 75 different faculty that have been undertaken. We've also had numerous educational efforts as well, and our partnership with the Hammer has been absolutely extraordinary in being able to bring this to you, the public, and have a good dialogue on really what the future of Los Angeles could really be under our hotter and drier future. When we first talked about having this as being our last in the series for this year, we really wanted to end on a high note from the standpoint of really looking at the heat issue and how do you thrive in a hotter Los Angeles rather than just basically the various different public health and ecosystem impacts that we're going to face. And as what we've seen in the last year plus with the inundation of just absolutely catastrophic fire and the continuation of really extreme heat and dryness. We've only had about 5.5 inches of rain in the last 20 months. And we see what the consequences of that are from the standpoint of the degree of fire, the air quality problems, and the like. So the focus is going to be heat island effect and what you're going to hear from the three speakers. But we understand in light of what's been going on within the region, there'll probably be some discussion in regards to fire. But that's not necessarily the expertise of the people on the panel, but obviously it is a pretty big issue for all of us right now. And so with that, really excited to get this program going, and here's George.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. My name is George Ban-Weiss. I'm a professor at University of Southern California in civil and environmental engineering. And I'm going to give a quick overview of some recent research that my group has done that's relevant to the discussion today. Let's see if I can get the pointer to work. I'm the guinea pig here. And my email is up there in case any of you have questions and want to engage in discussion at a future time. Okay, so after the introduction, I figure I should mention a couple things, especially because I'm the first speaker here. The topic, of course, is warming in Los Angeles, and so there are two causes currently of Los Angeles getting warmer over time. This is the first reason shown in this figure here. It's something that's called the urban heat island effect, and the urban heat island effect describes a phenomenon where cities are generally warmer than their rural surroundings. I'll talk in a minute about what causes the urban heat island effect. The magnitude of the urban heat island effect, meaning how much warmer is the city than the surroundings, varies by city, and it mostly varies by the natural land cover that the urban area is actually replacing. The daily profile of the urban heat island effect can vary by city too, meaning some cities have afternoon heat island effects where it's really the afternoon that the city is warmer, while other cities will have more discernible evening heat island effects where it's the evening that's warmer than the rural surroundings. And so it varies by city. So what causes the heat island effect? Well, it has to do with basically urbanization and how the process of urbanization changes land cover properties in cities relative to natural vegetative cover. And so what happens when you urbanize a location? Well, you add a bunch of pavements and buildings, and you remove vegetation for the most part. And so those pavements and other building materials are very dark, and they absorb a lot of sunlight, and that causes those surfaces to heat up in the sun. And then that heat is transferred into the air, into the atmosphere, and so that can warm up the air during the day. And those materials, we call them anthropogenic materials, pavements and buildings and things like that. They are also what we call thermally massive. They not only absorb heat, but they retain heat. And so that means that in the evening, when the sun goes down, those materials can store the heat and then release it. And so it's really the thermally massive aspect of the materials that can lead to the evening heat island effect. And then, of course, as we all know, vegetation provides shade, which keeps people and air and the surface cool. It also provides evaporative cooling. It works in the same way that your body cools itself by sweating. Basically, it's the heat that is removed from the system through the process of evaporating water. And so when you remove vegetation through the process of urbanization, that leads to warming too. And then I'll just briefly say anthropogenic heating. That's basically the fact that engines and air conditioners and things like that release waste heat into the atmosphere. I don't have a slide on this, but I should mention that, of course, another reason for warming in urban areas is the local impacts of climate change. Alex Hall at UCLA is one of the pioneers in this field, looking at how global climate change is affecting the climate of LA and how it may affect it over the next century. And so that is a more global scale phenomenon that has local impacts, whereas this urban heat island effect is a local scale phenomenon that has local scale impacts. So did a slide get skipped? Yeah, let's go to this one first. What can we do locally to reduce temperatures in Los Angeles? So the most important method for reducing temperatures in the globe is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at global scale. In a place like Los Angeles, we can vastly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that can have consequences that get sort of diluted to the global scale and then can impact LA locally. But if we want to have, and that's the most important way of attaining climate stability. But if we can also do things locally with smart land cover management that can reduce temperatures in a place like LA too. So the things listed on this slide here are various what we call urban heat mitigation strategies. The first three basically describe a technique where you can use materials rather than being dark, right, which I mentioned before causes the urban heat island. They can be reflective, so they basically reflect sunlight and stay cooler in the sun, and that means there's less heat transferred in the air above. So there are cool roofs. Those have been used pretty they've been used fairly extensively over the past 10 years, and there are different policies that require their use around California and in LA. So the photo on the top left there, let's see if I can get, that's a cool roof on a commercial building, and it's very reflective. And then this is an example of a solar reflective shingle, where these things can be manufactured in a way that they look basically like normal shingles, but they reflect sunlight. The same technique can be used for pavements and for walls. And then the other main class of technique is to increase vegetation. And so we'll talk about those more, I think, in the question and answer period in a little bit. What kind of impact can these technologies have? This is a study that my group published a couple years ago looking at the temperature reductions that could be attained from adopting cool roofs on buildings around the entire Southern California area. And what we found is that, wrong slide. What we found is that adopting cool roofs can reduce temperatures by quite a bit. The afternoon average temperature reduction from adopting cool roofs was about 1 degree Celsius. And then in the evening, temperatures were reduced by about 0.5 degree Celsius. One thing that we noted in this study that's important is that most roof area in a place like LA is coming from residential homes, not from commercial buildings. And previously, there were only policies that required cool roofs on commercial buildings. They were state-level energy efficiency targets, because not only do you cool the atmosphere, but you also cool the building, so it reduces energy use too. And so the city of LA, a few years back, required the use of cool roofs on residential homes, which is important for addressing urban heat island effects. I think this is the last slide. This puts the cool roofs in the perspective of future climate change. And so it looks at the extent to which adopting cool roofs could not just mitigate the urban heat island effect, but also partially reverse the future impacts of global climate change on a place like LA. And so what you can see, if you look at this top row, think of this like relative to today, what does LA look like in terms of temperature change with both global climate change and adoption of cool roofs? And then this panel here is a really kind of a low emissions scenario. It assumes that we do a lot to reduce greenhouse gases globally, and this assumes that we continue on a business as usual path and we don't do a whole lot globally. And so what you can see is that cool roofs can partially reduce the impacts of climate change, or partially reduce the impacts of climate change in most parts of LA, and in some parts, especially the areas where there are commercial buildings that can have super reflective roofs, they can actually fully reverse it and even cause some cooling. But then, unless there are really global scale reductions in greenhouse gases, cool roofs really can't do a whole lot in the face of climate change by the end of century. This is end of century. So it basically tells us that using local strategies like this are important. They can reduce energy use and they can have other benefits, but they're not going to work alone. For long-term climate stability in a place like LA, we need both urban heat mitigation strategies like this, but also global scale greenhouse gas reductions. I think that's it. So I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, to the next speaker, and I will be talking to you soon.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Do I need to click this? Oops. Do I need to hit something? There we go. Okay, so thank you to Mark and Claudia and Asma for organizing this and for inviting me. Once again, my name is Jisung Park. I'm a relatively new assistant professor at UCLA. I arrived here around a year ago. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how the heat that George was talking about affects our physiology and our cognitive function, and how we might want to think about that in the context of climate change policy and climate adaptation. But let me start with these images here. So if you were to run a Google search for the terms climate change or global warming, chances are the hits that you get are going to be accompanied by some variation of the following sort of image themes. So what do we have here? We've got this poor polar bear who unwittingly has become the flag bearer for biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction caused by climate change. Intensification of hurricanes, sea level rise, and then some variation of agricultural decline. These should be familiar images, and that's for a good reason. These are very imminent and very real threats caused by climate change. And personally, as someone who considers himself a child of the great outdoors, I find it very distressing to think about the ecological destruction and the biodiversity loss that is going to be felt for generations to come. That being said, as an economist and as someone who spends a lot of time looking at economic data, I can't help but wonder whether these searches should also begin to yield more images like this. Not in lieu of, but in addition to. So what am I talking about here? I guess I'm referring to the many people really the millions of people, whether it's workers whose occupations expose them to the elements day in and day out, or students who attend schools that have inadequate infrastructure or heat illness prevention protocols, right? These millions of people whose lives are going to be affected in maybe subtle ways, but in ways that in aggregate may amount to pretty large, what economists call welfare impacts. And impacts that probably are going to be highly unequal across the population, say across the income distribution. All right, just take a step back for a minute, tell you a little bit about the underlying science here. There have been a number of laboratory experiments, really beginning with pre-World War II studies of British naval officers, these poor guys you see over here, who were basically put into a hot room and asked to perform a series of tasks as they jacked up the temperature and see how they did. There have been a number of studies that aim to uncover the underlying relationship between temperature stress and human physiology and how that maps onto task productivity, whether it's cognitive tasks like interpreting Morse code or physical tasks like lifting boxes or guiding a steering wheel. And the basic stylized finding across these many studies is what you see here, this inverted U-shaped relationship between temperature and productivity. Both heat and cold seem to affect us, and I think anecdotally we've all been there, to the tune of roughly 1 to 2 percentage points decline in performance per degree Celsius, hotter or colder than room temperature. Now, for a very long time, most of this, what you might call ergonomic research, seems to have occurred in relative isolation from the research on climate impacts and how climate change will affect society. And I'm simplifying a little bit here, but until roughly around a decade or so ago, when a group of researchers at Harvard and MIT and Northwestern uncovered this pretty striking relationship between country-level GDP per capita and temperature. And happy to talk about the details during the Q&A, but basically what they found was that controlling for country-specific factors, a hotter than average year within a given country seemed to lead to lower GDP per capita and lower GDP growth per capita to the tune of anywhere between 0.5 percentage point to 2 percentage points per degree Celsius hotter than average. Now, the students of economics in the room know that if the US economy were to experience a 1 to 2% decline in GDP, that would be a major recession. So that's a big deal. It's still unclear what exactly is driving this relationship. There's still a lot of controversy over it, but the rigor of the statistical analysis, I think, is very much clear. There's been a number of recent studies, and these are studies that myself and others at UCLA and at Harvard and a couple of people actually in the audience have been working on that appear to suggest that at least some of that relationship, maybe even the lion's share, might be driven by how extreme heat affects labor productivity and labor capacity. So just to give you a flavor of the kind of research that's been going on here, when we look at county-level payroll per person, per worker, for a variety of industries in the roughly 3,000 counties in the United States over the past 3 decades, what we find is that within any given county, a year with more hot days seems to be associated with significantly lower payroll per person, or take-home pay. This is true both across the country as a whole, but specifically, or more intensely, for those workers in what OSHA calls highly exposed occupations. These are the people who work outdoors in construction, transportation, mining and utilities, agriculture, and actually, maybe surprisingly, people who work in manufacturing. There's some evidence that these manufacturing plants are not sufficiently air-conditioned. But in any event, the magnitude that we uncover is not trivial. A 2 or 3 degree Fahrenheit hotter than average year within the United States for some of these sectors results in decline of take-home pay anywhere between 5 and 10%. So I don't know about you, but if UCLA were to cut my paycheck by 10%, I think I would notice. But jokes aside, I think it's easy for those of us who work in primarily climate-controlled indoor environments to forget, A, how hard it is to work outside when it's hot when you're engaging in physical labor, and B, just how many people, even in the United States, which is one of the most developed economies on the planet, just how many people actually work in these kinds of sectors. By our estimates, at least 15 million, maybe upwards of 30 million, work in these sectors. Around 5 million people in California alone may be working in these exposed sectors. So maybe we want to worry also about how climate change might affect our labor capacity and productivity. We might also want to think a little bit about how extreme heat might affect our students and children and their ability to learn or perform. Again, happy to go into the details during the Q&A, but across a number of studies that I've been involved in and others have contributed to, we find that heat seems to affect student performance in a number of significant ways. For example, we had the opportunity to work with New York City public schools looking at their data for high school students who take what are called Regents exams. They're sort of like your high school exit exams you take at the end of the school year in June. And you take a number of these so you can kind of compare an individual student's performance relative to his or her own average. And we find that if a student is unlucky enough to take an exam on, say, an 85 or a 90-degree day, they seem to perform significantly worse, anywhere between 10 and 15% of a standard deviation, which is, a big deal for most of these students. And then in follow-up work with some co-authors at Harvard, we look at sort of the universe of middle school and high school students who take the PSAT exam over the last 20 or so years, and we actually find that the amount of cumulative heat, so it's not the exam day temperature, but the amount of cumulative heat exposure that you were exposed to during the school year in the vicinity of your school, seems to predict how well you do on the subsequent exam, and really how much you seem to have learned between two successive exams. So heat might be might be disrupting the learning process in subtle, right, but statistically significant ways. And one of the reasons why I find this distressing is, just from a policy standpoint, just how little data there is, just how little systematic data collection there has been when it comes to things like school infrastructure and adaptation policies. Okay, so let me just end maybe with a quick word about where to go and also about distributional equity and how we might want to try to think about targeting and supporting the most vulnerable given these effects. Just a couple of data points worth mentioning. For example, when we look across U.S. schools, in the limited survey data that we were able to put together, we find that minority students appear to be less likely to have working air conditioning at school, even when you control for things like area level income and local climate. There's also emerging evidence to suggest that workers at the sort of lower end of the income distribution are more likely to experience repeated heat exposure on the job as part of their occupation. And I guess to try to end on a less dour note, I have to say, as someone who's coming here from the East Coast, I've been really surprised at how much awareness there is, both within the public and also in the policy community, and a willingness to try to come up with creative policy solutions on this front. Just to mention a couple of examples there, currently other faculty at the Luskin Center and I are working with the Strategic Growth Council, the State Strategic Growth Council, to try to identify who within California might be most vulnerable to these heat impacts. But really, as a newcomer to the state, I'm very much looking forward to our conversation and to learning from all of you about what the best pathway forward should be. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Jisung. That was, both presentations were fantastic. And it's a reminder that there's just never a doubt that there is plenty to do and plenty of reasons to do it. And so I'm really excited to be part of the conversation today. And as George said, the number one thing that we can be doing to address the dangers, the concerns, the hazards that we're talking about with extreme heat is indeed reducing our greenhouse gas emissions first and foremost. And so before we get a little bit further into some specifics around the urban heat island work that we're doing in Los Angeles through Mayor Garcetti, my boss, I did want to say that just as a general level, the Sustainable City Plan itself is really looking at how do we take environment out of its box and ensure that we are finding solutions to climate change and to other key issues that really do address a number of factors throughout, not just sort of our general environmental concerns, or more conventional, I should say, environmental concerns around clean energy or clean water, but also how does that fit into as some of the things that this series has even addressed on mobility and clean transportation, on resilience here, economic opportunity, and in particular, as Jisung was just ending with, how are we ensuring that the work that we're doing is benefiting the most vulnerable communities, the communities that do need it most, and that have been largely left out of some of the great work that's been done on environmental solutions. So the mayor is extremely committed to finding solutions and fighting climate change, and really being a leader himself, and having Los Angeles and cities work together to lead that transition to a clean energy economy. And so, he is working across, and has us working across every sector with partners all over the city and all over the world to do just that, whether that's in pursuing clean energy and moving toward 100% renewable energy, whether that's to completely decarbonize our transportation sector here in Los Angeles, looking at waste, looking at a number of things, and there's no shortage of reasons why. The plan, when it was released in 2015, we were in the middle of a historic drought, and we're still seeing now what that sort of new normal, or I think even as Governor Brown said yesterday, the day before, the new abnormal that is California because of climate change. And so even our Los Angeles County fire chief, Darrell Osby said the other day, on Monday, that the fires that we're facing right now, he truly believes are due to and are influenced by climate change. And he's been there on the front lines for decades, and that's what he's seeing himself. So there are no shortage of reasons to do this work and things that we can be doing on that kind of global scale, as George rightly pointed out. Now, through the Sustainable City Plan, we also specifically look at the urban heat island effect, because one of the biggest concerns that we have for Los Angeles when it comes to major climate impacts is extreme heat. And that's something that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, just innately, what it means here in LA. And so there's a section in the Sustainable City Plan that specifically is looking at, as George pointed out, this urban-rural differential in our temperatures. And we were one of the first, if not the first, U.S. city to set a temperature reduction goal for the city. This is something that is being done outside of the U.S. And really what it was doing is helping us understand what is that differential, that temperature differential, and that we saw there was a study done by Yale that suggested it was about a 5-degree Celsius, or 5-degree Fahrenheit, I should say, urban-rural temperature differential for Los Angeles and our rural surroundings, and that we set a goal to reduce that temperature differential, and then kind of put together a series of policies to be able to do that. This has, just by setting that goal, it has brought a tremendous amount of attention to the issue of the urban heat island effect and the effect of extreme heat on Los Angeles, on everyday workers, on school kids, on how we get from place to place, waiting at a bus stop, whether you want to walk to work or to the grocery store or not on that day, whether you're going to go out to lunch that day if you work in an office environment. All of these things are things that we need to be thinking about. And it brought a lot of attention to what are some of those specific tactics that we can use. And I was, pleased to see in the slides, George, that you kind of agree with us in terms of the tactics that we're deploying, which are really this kind of three-legged stool around cool roofs, cool pavement, and urban tree canopy. And so those are kind of the key things that we are working on that I was just going to say a little bit about. So on the cool roofs piece, don't want to belabor this because we've heard a little bit about it, but as George said, we did pass an ordinance in 2014 requiring that all new or additional roofs installed residential would have to be a cool roof. And we did that by coupling it with a rebate from DWP. And so you can go in and get a rebate for that cool roof. You can do that because it has a tremendous amount of energy efficiency benefits by reducing the overall cooling load necessary for that home because of the reflective capacity of the roof. And so you actually do get a rebate, and we have over 50 million square feet of cool roof in the city, which itself is saving enough energy to power about 2,700 homes. So you can really see immediately the value, the multiple benefits of these types of policies, from both that resilience, urban heat adaptation, but also the energy efficiency benefits, which reduce our need for electricity, and that also have a really positive greenhouse gas savings at the same time. So there's multiple reasons, multiple benefits to these types of policies. We are, I think, really the first city to be leaning in on cool pavements, and we're still sort of at a pilot scale. We've got about 140,000 square feet of cool pavement laid throughout the city, and that really is evenly distributed throughout the city. But it was really neat because this was an initiative that we put in the Sustainable City Plan, that we wanted to push the market, that we really weren't seeing technologies, solutions for cool pavement out in the market. And so we set that goal of wanting to deploy some pilots around the city. And as part of the implementation of the mayor's Sustainable City Plan, we have departmental chief sustainability officers. So chief sustainability officers across every city department. If you weren't aware of that, I kind of have this exciting sort of network or army of fellow chief sustainability officers that I get to work with in the city. And we meet on a monthly basis. That's someone from the Department of Water and Power, Bureau of Sanitation, Bureau of Street Services, Animal Services, Rec and Parks, Department of Transportation, Emergency Management, Fire Department, Police Department, you name it. They're all there. We all meet every month to talk about sustainability and the implementation of the Sustainable City Plan. And so we were talking about cool pavement, and our chief sustainability officer for the Bureau of Street Services got up and he said, I've been talking to this company that really wants to pilot. They say they have this solution. I haven't really been able to find anyone else to really implement this initiative that we said we were going to do in the plan. But we can't do it on road yet. We have to test it off road, make sure that it passes all the safety tests to be used on road for vehicles. And so I need like a surface. I need a large surface. I need it to be in a hot, open area. And I just am kind of looking for some ideas. And that's what he got up and said in one of our meetings. And so our chief sustainability officer for the Rec and Parks Department stood up and he said, I've got a parking lot in, our Balboa Rec and Parks Recreation Center, and that's really big, dark surface, hot. It's time for maintenance on it anyway, so we were going to do something at that parking lot anyway. So why don't you take a piece of that and try it? And it's that kind of just happenstance collaboration that is happening every day in our office because of the way we're managing the implementation of the Sustainable City Plan. But lo and behold, we went ahead and did that and saw that there was a 10-degree improvement in temperature right there in that parking lot between the non-resurfaced part of the lot and the others. And so we got really excited about it and wanted to start testing it on road, because when it was in that parking lot, you could do skid tests and other safety tests with vehicles. And this technology kind of passed all of that, reflectivity tests, everything. So City Council provided a budget to Street Services to pilot it in every City Council district. And so this has been happening in every district. This is a real picture. And it has gotten so much attention from around the world, literally around the world, folks coming in from jurisdictions everywhere. I just had local news from Phoenix here to talk about this, and go check out a swath of street. And not to mention, it's not just Phoenix, but it's Melbourne and Sydney, and it's really all over. So it really has been an exciting opportunity to kind of start solving problems jointly with other cities and other jurisdictions, and pushing the market and saying we actually really need some new technologies to be able to solve this problem. And then finally, for so many reasons as well, building up our urban tree canopy. And this has a huge equity component as well, because where we look at what parts of the city have the least tree cover, have the least sort of natural shade, we are looking at some of the sort of porous parts of the city, and that's not okay, and that's something that we have to fix. And that's how we're thinking about the solutions that we're applying when it comes to addressing climate change, is how are we looking at what some of the economic opportunities are and where the disparities lie in terms of targeting the initial solutions. So we have planted over 100,000 trees over the last 5 years, and that's about, if you look at street trees, that's about 600 miles of trees. And it's so important from a shading perspective. It's so important from just the cooling impacts of evapotranspiration, just the cooling impact of the trees themselves, not just the shade, but also when we look at the combination with drought and the ability to capture rainwater, and not sort of lose it completely, either to replenish our groundwater or to, to save it for the trees themselves. We've really seen that as part of our drought response, we can't lose the trees at the same time. And they're a really important component to our overall drought response and local water conservation goals, as well as our cooling goals. So we have spent a significant amount of time and energy into developing urban tree canopy solutions throughout the city. And then I thought I would just, in my last minute probably at this point, mention kind of an anecdote of one of the situations we saw with regard to an extreme heat event. And I'm sure that many of you, if you were here, remember the 4th of July weekend just a few months ago, where we saw quite an extreme heat event, where on, I believe it was Thursday, July 5th, we were already well into a heat wave. It was about in the 80s in the downtown metro parts of LA, and in the upper 90s to 100s in the valley. And then overnight into July 6th, the metro area went up 20 degrees, just like that. And we were pretty much, 111 degrees at UCLA on Friday, July 6th, basically matching. It was just as hot in the metro area as it was in the valley. And it stayed that way for a couple of days. And this was something that, to us, really spoke to the fact that climate change is changing the way we are experiencing extreme weather in Los Angeles, and that we have to not just adapt our systems, but be ready for things that we're not expecting to have happen. And so one of the things that was the most notable about what happened with the heat wave were the significant electricity outages that we saw in the area. And possibly some of you lost power, whether you were in the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power's service territory or Southern California Edison service territory. There were major losses. One of the really interesting, from sort of a climate science standpoint, one of the interesting components to this that we saw is that the outages were happening more in the metro, downtown, Koreatown, Windsor Square, Mid-Wilshire areas, which is not typically where DWP, where we would see those outages. We're used to seeing them more in the valley. And one of the things that we've realized is that as DWP is in planning its maintenance of the electrical system, it had been prioritizing the valley because of its historical sort of trends of more outages than downtown and metro areas. And so we learned that we can't make those assumptions anymore, and we have to be going about our business a little bit differently. We also learned that some of the responses that we were anticipating seeing, like the use of cooling centers. So we knew we were coming to a heat wave, and we put out a ton of messaging around where to go, if you need a cooling center, if you need a cool place to be, and they weren't really used. And so we're really interested in kind of understanding, what did people do? Because what we thought people were going to do, they didn't necessarily do in reaction to the heat wave. And so understanding how do we provide the right services for the people that need it the most is something that we really are looking to work with the scientific community and our community partners on is, they're very close to the neighborhoods, and so can come to us with what are the needs of those individual communities and neighborhoods, and we can start to design policies and solutions around them. So I'll leave it at that, just to say that a lot of the work that we're doing is very much informed by the work that's happening at UCLA, at USC, by the community partners that I see here today in the audience as well. And that hopefully those policy solution sets that we put forward really are informed by all of that and vice versa. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you.
All right. So let's get to it. So George, you talked about the heat island impacts and gave us a much better understanding of that. How does that vary throughout the region and what you see in impacts? And does it vary not just by geography, the San Fernando Valley, San Gabriel Valley, or the downtown urban core? But are there also, specific land uses, from the standpoint, is commercial a lot worse, obviously, than residential? What are the sorts of things from the standpoint that we should know on the variability on heat island impacts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's a tricky one to answer in a place that's as complicated as Los Angeles. Historically, the urban heat island effect is thought of as a city-wide phenomenon because most cities have fairly uniform temperature distributions. So really, the comparison is to look at something that's roughly representative of an urban average temperature and then compare it to the rural surroundings. LA is unique because, first of all, there isn't really a rural surrounding. It's all urban, and the surrounding is ocean or mountains. So there isn't a great reference point, and that's been one of the things that's been very interesting, both from a policy perspective and scientifically, to be talking with Lauren's office about things like how to actually, over time, test whether the plan is being met. How do we define the urban heat island in Los Angeles? And so some work that has been done by my group in collaboration also with folks at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, where I used to work, and some other consultants, we literally strapped a high accuracy temperature sensor to a car and drove around LA and tried to look at temperature variability. We do a lot of modeling, probably more modeling than measurements, but modeling isn't reality. Part of that project was actually to test models too and do some evaluation, but there's nothing like just measuring temperature around the city, and so what we found is that you can observe pockets. I mean, as you know from everyday experience too, you can observe pockets of hot neighborhoods and relatively cooler neighborhoods. And it's a little bit hard to observe because the predominant temperature variation in LA has to do with the sea breeze, right? And so that's the main reason that the east part of the basin is warmer than the west part, right? It has to do with proximity to the ocean. And so actually teasing out the effect of land cover on temperature is tricky to do here. But what we found is that essentially all over the basin you can find hot spots and cool spots. A collaborator, Haider Taha, coined the term. It's kind of an urban heat archipelago. Am I saying that word correctly?
Archipelago.
Archipelago. I usually refrain from saying the word because I don't know how to pronounce it. And I decided to pronounce it for the first time right here and failed. Apparently.
And you guys saw it.
And you saw me fall flat on my face. Anyway, I've read the word though. Anyway, you can have hot spots, cool spots, and that is layered on top of the effect of the sea breeze. And so what we found was a little, in some respects, counter to what we expected, where a lot of the times what we saw was some of the commercial regions were relatively cooler because they had so many cool roofs. And part of what we saw in this study was really the first evidence where we measure cool roofs at the neighborhood scale leading to, well, I shouldn't say leading to, associated with temperature reductions. There are other things that are co-varying too. But so that was a really interesting outcome of the project. The other thing, as you would expect, is that areas that have increased tree cover also are relatively cooler to adjacent regions where, all else being equal, they have less tree cover. And from a thermal comfort point of view, what we feel, around the city, it's really, tree cover is very important, largely from a shading effect point of view. That's one of the most important drivers of thermal comfort of pedestrians, is whether or not you're in shade. And you know that from everyday experience too. That's one of, we can talk later maybe, that's one of the interesting things that makes the idea of cool pavements not as much of a no-brainer, in my opinion, as cool roofs are. But we can talk later about that.
So just as a follow-up on that, and believe me, I'll include you guys in a second on the rest of these discussions, but have you or any of your colleagues done much in the way of seeing heat island impacts, pre and post development, and really seeing, how big of a difference that is? So you sort of look at before development and then after, and see temperature differences. And also, since you've been at this for a little while anyways, are you starting to see any temporal variability from the standpoint of year to year in comparison of the heat island impacts increasing over time, or has it still been too short of a temporal scale at this point to really determine?
That's a great question. When you say heat island impacts, you're talking about temperature, basically, right?
Sorry.
Right? Just to make sure.
Just temperature. Sorry
Just to
about
make
that.
sure I'm interpreting correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are studies out there that look at the effects of urbanization on temperature and also the effects of heat mitigation strategies on temperature. Most of those studies focus on, we have to get into the distinctions of temperature because temperature is an ambiguous term. Most of those studies look at surface temperature, right? So it's literally the scientists will call it skin temperature. It's the surface. The temperature of the surface itself. The reason why most studies will do that is that that's what satellite sensors actually measure. Is they measure indirectly the temperature of the surface. Why do we use satellite observations for that? Well, that's what you need to get a large enough spatial scale to be able to tell what the effects of development or urbanization, things like that, actually are. There's a downside to that, though, which is that surface temperature, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's not as relevant as air temperature is with regard to our comfort, with regard to air conditioning, energy use, things like that. So there have not been that many studies. In fact, I don't know of any that really track the effects of air temperature over a long enough period of time to be able to tell what the influence of urbanization is and things like that. There are plenty of modeling studies that do. The slide that I skipped over, kind of unintentionally, but thinking it was something else, I was blinded by the lights up here, was a study that we did to try to quantify the effect of urbanization in Los Angeles. As I mentioned before, because there isn't a good rural reference point for LA, another way to think about, right, if you take a step back and you think, okay, why do we define the urban heat island effect as urban minus rural? It's because the rural is a proxy for what the city was before development, right? And so what we did in this study is to say, okay, well, with a model, you can do anything with a model. So let's basically model the city of LA, the climate of the city of LA as it is now. And then in the model, you have the power to change the characteristics of the land surface. And so we use satellite data to try to come up with our best estimate of what the land surface was prior to urbanization in LA. There's, of course, uncertainty attached to that. And then we did a model simulation where the city of LA was as it was before urbanization, or our best estimate of it. And so with that, we were able to, model basically the intensity of the urban heat island effect or the effect of urbanization on air temperature. And what we found was that, as expected, urbanization has had a larger effect on air temperature in the evening than during the day, as a lot of cities have. It's the surface temperature that has a larger effect during the day. The air temperature has a larger effect in the evening. And boy, I need to think. It was something like the evening urban heat island, or the effect of urbanization on evening temperature, was something like 3 degrees Celsius, or roughly 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The daytime urban heat island effect was a bit less, about half that. So that's.
Right. No,
Okay.
that covers a lot. Yeah. So I mean, I obviously from the standpoint of what you were talking about in the introduction with some of the work that Alex Hall and others have done, talking about the air temperature differences, and then in conjunction, obviously this is a additive effect to some degree with heat island and with not having reflective surfaces and tree canopy and those sorts of issues. And so it's not a matter of one versus the other. It's that we're experiencing both. And in that regard, Jisung, you talked a little bit about school performance and equity issues. Can you also give us some idea from the standpoint of work that some of your colleagues have done on workplace impacts from working in extreme heat, and then on top of that, what are the other sort of physiological responses other than decreased work performance that we should all be looking for in these situations?
Yeah, for sure. So because I'm an environment and labor economist by training, I focused on sort of the human capital and labor productivity impacts. The epidemiologists in the room were probably piping up, but there's a lot of literature on mortality. And indeed, that was the earlier literature, right? For a while, we've known that hot days kill, right? And it's especially deadly for infants and the very elderly populations. This is still true in the United States, although it's much less true today than it was, say, 3 or 4 decades ago. And that's some of the work I think you're referring to. Alan Barreca at IOES and other colleagues have documented sort of this decline in the heat mortality relationship in the United States, and they find that they find evidence suggesting that a lot of that is driven by increased air conditioning adoption. So we know that heat kills, and heat kills at a much higher rate in developing countries than it does in the United States. There's another part of the question about worker impacts, productivity mix. Yeah, so there are now several studies that find, in addition to workers who are outdoors being affected in terms of payroll, that's what I was talking about earlier, that their productivity falls. There are papers looking at automobile manufacturing plants in the United States, and the productivity across, say, a week that had more 90-degree days, the productivity seems to fall. And interestingly, apparently they're not able to make up for it later. Maybe it's because they don't want to pay overtime. Now I'm speculating. But there are now sort of a steady stream of papers that have been finding this kind of relationship in a variety of contexts in both developing and developed countries.
So, Lauren, C of LA has been a leader on climate and climate adaptation. I've said over the last year or so that I've been extremely impressed by the state of California's leadership on climate mitigation, but the reality is we have a lot that we could be doing on climate adaptation that we barely scratched the surface on. I think LA has tried to lead by example. I think San Francisco has tried to lead by example. There's other cities that have done so, but it's really been more at the city level than at the state level. The leadership has really been on the mitigation side at the state level. So you've instituted a number of different programs. You talked a little bit about the Cool Roof program. You guys are pretty tough from the standpoint of new roofs. The big problem that we see on so many different issues is, what do you do about the retrofits? To actually have to improve the environment one new development at a time doesn't really work. Whether it's stormwater capture or whether it's penetration in solar, whatever the case may be. And so this struggle of what do you do to try to deal with the retrofit issue and really have greater penetration of cool roof programs? What are the sorts of things you guys are thinking about at the city to make that happen?
That's a great question, and just to say, just to make sure it's clear when we're talking about mitigation versus adaptation, and and just the idea that greenhouse gas mitigation itself, or climate mitigation, is really an effort to proactively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to prevent further warming, versus, although not really versus, but whereas the term adaptation is really looking at how are we becoming more equipped to deal with the climate impacts that we are seeing, and focusing on that kind of that reaction, if you will, to the impacts and preparation. And so when you're asking about any policy that is dealing with existing infrastructure is slow moving, because yes, if you're only dealing with the new things coming online, that is a tiny proportion of the actual infrastructure that we need to be dealing with. And so when it comes to buildings, it's not just a question of cool roofs. It's everything. It's all energy efficiency improvements that we need to be making. It is on energy efficiency, on water efficiency, on we've seen this with seismic retrofits. I mean, there's a number of things that we need to be dealing with our existing building stock. That is why we have incentives, is to try to encourage people to make the right decision and to be able to do this proactively. We haven't required it in the same way. If you look at what we did with our seismic retrofit program, which did require soft story buildings to have to go back and retrofit their buildings, and that was accompanied by incentives as well. We haven't mandated it in that same way with cool roofs, but it's something that we can be, we ought to be looking at. It's the same thing as we're thinking about a number of infrastructure improvements that need to be made across, as I said, our building stock. It's very incremental to be doing it with just new, or when you do a refurbishment or an addition. It's a great place to get it. If you are going to fix your roof or you're going to do an add-on, it's a great moment. And so we have to have the policies in place to be able to get it at those moments, for sure. But totally agree with you, it's very incremental. And so it's a type of policy that we need to be considering, as right now we're going through a refresh of our sustainable city plan, looking at how we are hitting our goals, how we need to be going further, what policies we need to be putting in place in order to do that.
So does the city of LA, or any city that you know of, actually, have they created any sort of incentive programs to do retrofits the same way we see, all sorts of incentives from the standpoint of putting solar on your roof, or, purchasing electric cars, or the economists can jump in anytime as well, from the standpoint of really making that sort of retrofit happen?
Well, I mean, we do have the incentive in place.
So what is the incentive in Los Angeles?
Well, I mean, it's delivered by DWP. It's a 20-cent per square foot rebate for cool roofs.
Mm-hmm.
So you can submit your information to DWP, and you say you show the roof replacement, how many square footage, and then they'll give you the rebate for that amount. That is done, that can be done on a volunteer basis. There's a legal requirement on the residential side for new roofs, that yes, you can access the benefit of the rebate at the same time, but you can do it voluntarily. On the commercial side, I think you mentioned Title 24 as well, which is a building energy efficiency code. And so that is part of code. But again, the approach that we've been taking is that we want people to make the right decision and not just force them to. And so we know that we are reaping multiple benefits by paying people to do the right thing. The county has followed suit and took cues from us and did a study on a cool roof ordinance, and I believe is phasing that in themselves right now, and our Department of Building and Safety helped them with that. And we know that there are other cities in Northern California that are doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, it's great that the city's leading by example. One of the things I've seen, is I'm far more familiar on the water side, and seeing where water incentives work and where they don't work, and it's very interesting to sort of watch that. So if you want someone to put in, a water efficient washing machine, and you're only offering a $50 rebate, nobody's going to do it. But if you're offering a $400 rebate, and the price of the washer is like $600, it's amazing. You're going to get a lot of people willing to do it. I'm just wondering, and the same thing we've seen on things like turf removal, where LA has been a leader in augmenting what Metropolitan Water District has offered on those sorts of incentives. Are you seeing the price point on cool roofs? Is that enough to catch people's attention? Is it working in that regard to do retrofits? Or are you just sort of, at this point, still trying to sort of figure out what the right price point is to really get that program up and going on retrofit as opposed to new roofs?
I think that what we're trying to do is work with solution providers to be able to provide more options for people, that this is something that we really want the market to respond to. And we've already seen, and I think in my slide, there's a number of different, the solar reflective shingles. I mean, there's a number of different technologies that are starting to come and become available. That's what we want to see more of. I think that we can see people take more proactive choice when they have some attractive options. I think the price point is probably something that we're seeing is okay because the requirement itself hasn't really come with a lot of frustration from homeowners or from the building industry, that the incentive is there to really help counterbalance the cost of the mandate itself. So we felt that we saw that from a mandating perspective, that was a nice match. So really, it's education is extremely important, and different, I think, just sort of different options in the market that would really help move things forward. Okay. And that's just our one experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great. Did you want to add anything to that?
No.
From an economic perspective. Okay.
I'll pass. I might have to say archipelago, and that would be embarrassing.
Everyone's
one
starting
up
for
me
that.
already.
Galapagos. All right. So one of the issues that I think we've actually talked about in previous panels is really this issue of tree canopy, and it's a tough one. I mean, cities struggle with this in a big way. We saw Mayor Villaraigosa with the 1 million trees ordinance, and it was all about 1 million trees. And now we're sort of seeing the city looking at this in a very different way from the standpoint of what are the multi-benefits of a tree canopy. And there's been a lot of research, all over the world on this in urban areas, from the standpoint of those benefits, from the standpoint of temperature, public health benefits, water infiltration benefits, even biodiversity benefits. But you look at tree programs, and they haven't really utilized the best available science to sort of design those tree canopy programs. And on top of that, with climate change impacts, we're also seeing proliferation of invasive species that makes some of those decisions even tougher, with things like the shot-hole borer invading a lot of our street trees and some of the impacts there. Where do you, this is open to any of the three, where do you see the opportunity to better use science from the standpoint of literally it could be worker productivity and public health and safety, to reducing temperatures, all the other benefits that cities want to see from trees, with the tension of how much are you going to irrigate those trees, and we're trying to reduce our water consumption. How do you see us moving forward with a much smarter approach to building our urban canopies, and why should we be doing that? Anyone want to take a first stab?
Can I jump in with a token economist first stab? I guess just getting back to something you were saying earlier about mitigation versus adaptation. In this instance, I think it's worth maybe remembering or reiterating that unlike climate change mitigation, which is a global public good problem where there's a very clear impetus for government to intervene and make those decisions, or help us make those decisions. With adaptation, it's not quite clear which aspects of adaptation are going to require the most government sort of nudging to get us to the optimal level. Whether it could be that things like air conditioning are just not affordable to some, and so the solution there might be to try to target those households for whom it is not affordable. You want it, can't afford it, so you're not getting it. But it could be that just over time we'll see some private investments being made. And so I guess my attempt at an answer would be to try to, maybe through small-scale experiments, figure out which kinds of adaptation investments are individuals having the most trouble making on their own, It could be because it's sort of a local public good. I can't go out and just plant a tree on the sidewalk. I guess not legally. I don't know what the rules are, right? But where are the market failures in terms of where the local government can really help the adaptation investments that are wanting to be made, but because of collective action problems, for example, are not being made. So that's one.
I mean, you mentioned I think so, and you mentioned the term multi-benefit. And so, when we're looking at our investments and, you truly are expressing your values through how you spend your dollars, we've had the benefit of working with researchers, working with some of our community partners who are helping us basically put together really just even mapping tools so that we can layer on data about things that we care about. We can layer on data of where do we know we don't have a lot of trees, or where are the trees. We can add data to that about where are the most disadvantaged communities throughout Los Angeles. We can add on data around where are our groundwater basins, where there can be added value to be able to absorb that water with green infrastructure there. And we can add on all these different sort of pieces of data and be able to see hopefully see some areas that are really starting to stand out as multi-benefit for investing in those areas. And that's something that we proactively are doing. And we're trying to match up as many of those values at the same time. It's not to say that's the only place we're going to do it, but that is what we're trying to achieve when we spend our dollars. And we know that planting trees has a great greenhouse gas mitigation benefit as well by absorbing carbon.
And George, do you provide heat maps to sort of give people an idea of, the city or the county or the agencies' ideas of maybe where it makes the most sense to expand on Canopy? Is that something that you've started to do?
Yeah, that kind of thing is being done. I have a couple different research projects that are looking into that. Basically, where should the trees go? What are the objectives for deciding where they should go? And then what are the properties for the trees? Right, so it's where do they go and what types of trees? When you decide what types of trees, I think essentially you want trees that provide a good amount of shade. The catch-22 question is, we don't want to increase water use, right? So then it requires trees that, or I should say, you want to use trees that don't require a ton of water, but the catch-22 is that the evapotranspiration is what gives you part of the cooling benefit. So if you don't use water, then you don't get the evapotranspiration benefit. But still, I think the shading benefit is equally or more important than the evapotranspiration benefit. So it's basically shade, decide what you want to do with the water use question, probably use trees that don't require water. Another interesting one is volatile organic compound emissions. So a lot of people don't know that vegetation and some species of trees are actually polluters. So they emit volatile organic compounds that are precursors to photochemical smog. So if you look at a lot of East Coast cities, a lot of their pollution stems partially from emissions that come from forests. The beauty, though, is that you can pick tree species that don't have VOC emissions or have very small VOC emissions, and then you can solve that issue.
I thought you were going to go the President Reagan route, and I was going to have an issue, but
So eucalyptus trees are an example of one that actually emit a lot of VOC. That's why they smell good. I've had the good fortune of being part of a committee that started several months ago that is called the Edith. What's the name of it?
Well, it's not really a committee.
Oh, that's true. It's a non-committee. Urban cooling and heat impacts. Anyway, it includes an amazing collection of people. It sounds very similar to the group of people that you talked about that got that first cool pavement thing done. It's so basically representatives from various branches of city and county government, including Lauren's group and many others. And we meet monthly and talk about this exact question: what are the objectives for cooling LA? We even got back to the basics and had a whole meeting on what is temperature, which was, right up my alley at least. And anyway, that has been the kind of thing where we've discussed that exact thing. You know, how do we decide on what the objectives are? Once we decide, what's the research that needs to be done to you know, identify where various heat mitigation strategies should go? And once you have the objectives clearly defined, it's not actually that hard to figure out how to meet them.
All right, great. Let's open it up to the audience. All right, we will let the people at the hammer sort of pick who's asking.
Hi, my name is Andrea Leon Grossman. I'm with Food and Water Watch, and my question is for Lauren. Thank you for coming tonight. It was very interesting, your presentation, all of you. My question is for Mayor Eric Garcetti. Will he reassure us that he will not invest any more money in dirty fossil fuel infrastructure, especially for DWP plants along the coastline, Scattergood, Haynes, and Harbor? We just basically approved the biggest gas power plant in Utah. So I just hope that we can get a commitment that there's going to be no more investments in dirty fossil fuel infrastructure.
Thank you, Andrea. And you know that we're working with your team on this a lot. And I was just with some of your folks yesterday, in fact, on this very topic. But you know, as I mentioned before, you know, very much recognize and embrace that the first and foremost thing that we need to be doing to prevent extreme heat in Los Angeles and beyond is to reduce and eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions, and that is why Mayor Garcetti did commit to being carbon neutral as a city by 2050, and you know, got ahead of the state in committing DWP to a path to 100% renewable energy. And now we're in a great spot where the state has passed that law as well, and so we're really now working in tandem. So that is a process that, and an amazingly comprehensive study that we are working through right now, and in real time, figuring out how we are continuously replacing our fossil portfolio with renewable energy and phasing out carbon-based fuels. And as the mayor has said in the past, that, you know, at one point it was about getting off of coal, and now it really, you know, he really does see that it is getting off of carbon. And so that's where we currently are. And, you know, DWP has already committed to surpassing the state goals, interim goals that are already set. And so, you know, we will be at a minimum of 70% renewable energy by 2036, 55% renewable energy by 2025. I mean, that's like around the corner. And so, you know, it's an incredibly exciting moment to be in LA, to see the amount of commitment and vigor that's being put into both sides of the equation on greenhouse gas mitigation and renewable energy, as well as adaptation and addressing urban heat. So that is something that we are completely committed to and will adhere to, and hope really that we lead the state and lead the other utilities in their efforts as well.
So in our limited time, the questions, let's try to focus on climate adaptation questions in regards to heat. We've had a couple of mitigation panels already here. It doesn't mean it's not critical. Obviously, that's why we focused on that earlier. But I'm sure there's a lot of adaptation questions. One of the things that strikes me as an example is that City of Los Angeles has climate adaptation plan. There's less than 10 of the 88 cities in LA County that actually have climate adaptation plans. So it sort of tells you it's not as good as it should be. It's not mandated in the state of California. That's something that's a glaring gap that you might try to see legislation. Someone in legislation might try to fix that in the next couple of years. But what other adaptation questions do we have on heat?
Here, I have the mic. Hi, I'm Harvey Wasserman. Lauren, thank you for coming on my California Solartopia show, which is at KPFK tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. We talk about exactly these issues, and I hope you other panelists will come on with me. I have a roof in the valley. I want to put solar panels on it. Do you also offer the climate mitigation rebates with the solar panels? I have a black roof. I could paint it white, or I can put solar panels on it. How do the rebates sort of mesh on those two projects?
I assume that's you, Lauren.
I assume that's me. So there are two different programs. There are definitely ways to mesh both, and actually, there's been a lot of really cool projects done in some low-income communities to replace roofs with a cool roof that then makes their roof be strong enough to add solar on top of it. And we see a lot of good properties for the solar panels at the same time to be able to be adhere to a cooler roof anyway. So there's a lot of good reasons to do both. There's two different programs. We do still have a solar incentive program. So you can access rebates through DWP for both those types of retrofits that you might want to do to your home, which would be very cool. And of course, then that solar would be net metered. So you would be, paid for the electricity that you would be, if you are making more electricity than you're using in your home and you put it back in the grid, you'd be able to be compensated for that as well.
Can I say one quick thing? You might be asking yourself too, what is the impact of adopting solar PV on my home on the urban climate of LA? Were you wondering that?
What is it?
And the answer is that it is actually beneficial. So in many ways, you can think of solar PV on a residential home as both climate mitigation, meaning it reduces CO2 emissions, but also adaptation. Because though a solar panel looks dark, assuming it's a pretty efficient solar panel, a ton of the incoming sunlight gets converted to electricity, of course, right? And so if you do the calculations on sort of an equivalent reflectivity of a solar panel compared to a residential cool roof, they're relatively similar. So basically you get the same urban climate benefits with solar PV as you do for a cool roof. And actually, in some ways, you get a little more with solar PV, assuming it's really efficient, compared to at least the requirement for reflectivity, the current requirement for reflectivity.
And you
Great
gain some
info.
efficiencies by putting it on a cool roof. You
Well,
gain
that's
some
true.
efficiencies on the panel itself.
Yeah, if you put it on a cool roof, solar PV is more efficient at lower temperatures. So
That's great. Next question.
So I have a question that's maybe a little tangential. If it's not appropriate for this forum, please feel free to move on, but maybe you can direct us or direct me to where we can find out some kind of a insight on this. But it's this is not regarding heat, but it's regarding infrastructure for, let's say, creeks and the LA River tributary. For those of us who live kind of close to them, this is a concern. So 12 inches of rain, let's say in 2018, in one day, is going to be pretty different from 12 inches of rain back in 1980. And the reason is there's a lot more asphalt, concrete development. And instead of that water seeping into the ground, a lot more of it is basically funneled into the creeks now. And the creeks, unlike the freeways, we haven't built any more creeks. They're not getting any wider. They're not getting any deeper. So the creek capacity in LA is more or less the same as it's been for 40 years, as far as I can tell. So just the mere fact that 12 inches between 30 years is now more problematic, compound that with the fact that we're going to have more intense rains. So communities downstream.
So the question.
I guess the question is 100-year flood possibilities. I mean, there's a lot more possibility for floods now, potentially. Is there something that can be done? What is the mitigation plan for these types of issues?
Okay, so I would say two things. One, yeah, definitely not topic, but because it's my favorite topic, I'll answer it really quickly, which is thank you, everybody, for passing Measure W. I think that will go a long way towards making something happen here. And the City of Los Angeles and the County of Los Angeles have very strong low-impact development ordinances, which are designed to get the watershed to behave the way it used to before we paved it over. And so you actually have to retain runoff on site and infiltrate it into the ground. The problem, again, is the retrofit problem. And so I think Measure W could change that to a fair amount, because I think there's going to be all sorts of Green Street projects that are going to be approved that are going to infiltrate water into the ground and really reduce those peak flows that you're talking about. And really what we've seen is an increase in flows, for example, in the LA River watershed, almost by a factor of 3 to 5 during the last 60 years. And so returning back to a pre-development or small development hydrologic regime is a goal in doing that. But let's get back to heat. So a couple last questions.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for all you're doing. This is a question about, I like the word incentive, and some of the things that are causing more problems for climate change. So how would you make people aware, for example, or give them incentive to not run their vehicles and sit in parked vehicles with their air conditioning on and their cell phones as the heat gets greater and greater, and they use that as an excuse for just doing that, and they're running their gasoline engines in a parked vehicle, which also the catalytic converters don't work as well, so it's causing a worse kind of particulate pollution.
So are you getting at the don't beat the heat by hanging out in your car with your air conditioner?
Right. So what's the incentive for people not to do that, because it's epidemic?
I'm guessing you, Jisung. You get the first
I'll give it
shot
a
at this one.
Maybe I would couch the question more broadly in terms of, okay, isn't there an irony here if we're trying to adapt to climate change by doing the thing that causes climate change in the first place? Okay, I don't know about necessarily the car example. I guess that makes sense too. But say air conditioning generally, maybe that's one of the reasons why I think all three of us, would like to continue to reiterate that it's not mitigation or adaptation, it's mitigation and adaptation, recognizing the fact that the mitigation that we do today, unfortunately, is not going to affect the climate change that happens next year. There's a lot of inertia in the climate system, so we've baked in some amount of warming. But I think the real answer to your question is, I'm not an engineer, but to my knowledge, there's not necessarily anything about cooling or air conditioning if the electricity were to come from a carbon neutral grid that needs to necessarily add to the climate problem. And so the onus, if anything, our conversation about how adaptation policy or incentives will affect the adoption of things like air conditioning should give us more of an incentive to double down on making the energy infrastructure carbon neutral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good answer. All right, last question, somewhere over here.
Hi, my question is for Lauren, and the city's sustainability plan sounds great. And how much money is the city committing to doing things? I love trees. Lots of trees in our neighborhood. It's really expensive to prune a tree to keep it healthy, and the city prunes them once every, I have no idea, 10 years, 15. So trees are great. Love trees. How do we keep them healthy? Is the city willing to do, what kind of money is the city willing to put behind that sustainability plan? Not just with trees, but with whatever. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And it's more than trees, but you're right. In all of those types of investments, particularly on the kind of green infrastructure side, one of the biggest, toughest areas of work is around the long-term maintenance of these projects, right? And so that's why when we push for funding opportunities like with Measure W, we are ensuring that projects that we're investing in have funding baked in for long-term maintenance, operations and maintenance, and not just kind of the planting the tree or breaking the ground and getting the project done. So it's something, it's a lesson learned at this point, that there are a lot of great things that we've had in place that don't necessarily have not historically had funding for long-term maintenance, and that's something that we're looking at as we're making new investments, changing that pattern so that we know. The plan broadly, though, covers kind of almost a little bit of everything that we're doing in the city. I mean, if you look at the rebates that we're providing on solar, or the rebates that we provide on energy efficiency, the rebates that we provide for water conservation, whether that's regarding turf turnover and replacing your turf with drought-tolerant landscaping and the funding that we've provided for that, or funding that we provide to change out your appliances to more either energy efficient or water efficiency. So that's like one type of budget, right? And then there is budget around our maintenance of our streets and street trees, or through our rec and parks and trees in our parks. That's another set of budget. But then there's also the money that we're spending, for example, to completely overhaul our own municipal fleet so that they are zero emissions fleet. We have a policy in place that for every year that we are making procurements of new vehicles, at least 50% of them have to be zero emissions, and we're vastly beating that target. And so, you know, the dominant type of vehicles that we are, as we're replacing vehicles, are zero emission vehicles. But that also is another type of investment. You know, we've committed to, essentially, we will not procure, I don't think, certainly by 2025, but I don't think at this point any more fossil fuel powered buses in the city of Los Angeles. And we will be a completely zero emissions bus fleet by 2030, if not sooner. But as a result, you won't see a single new bus that isn't a zero emissions bus in the city. And the county metro has committed to doing the same thing. And so when we look at sort of the budget across everything that we're doing in the plan, it includes all of these different types of investments, and understanding that, you know, it's not just about buying that bus or buying that vehicle, but we have to think about the accompanying electrical infrastructure that we have to be servicing in order to provide the charging load, or the charging capabilities for those vehicles. So there's a number of different things that you're right. It's not just the planting the tree. It's how do we maintain the tree. It's not just buying the bus, but we have to then completely overhaul the electrical system to provide a fast charging station, you know, in every fire station that we want them in, as the fire department is now committed to changing over its fleet. So it's a number of different areas that we're looking at that are attacking sustainability from all sides.
All right, well, I'd like to thank our panelists tonight for, I think, a really good discussion on a pretty critical issue. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Also, thank you, everyone at the Hammer, for hosting this series. It's been really incredibly informative, and hopefully you guys got a lot out of it. I think the more we do this, the more you understand there's other questions that we haven't answered, and maybe that's something that we'll be looking for in the future, and having future events here at the Hammer. We'll work with Claudia Bester and her amazing team to try to figure something out. I'm astonished we didn't get fire questions. But I can imagine sometime in the near future us having a fire panel that really gets into things in a lot more detail, because you know you do see this incredible work that we're all doing at the city level on mitigation, and it makes you realize that we need to do a good job in our natural lands as well. From the standpoint of making sure that the scope and scale of these fires aren't going to undo everything that we're doing in our incredible mitigation efforts that we see to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation and from our transportation systems. And we gotta do a better job on that. And I think that's a pretty major lesson we've learned in California in the last year and a half, that's for sure. So once again, thank you guys so much for coming out, and hopefully you learned a lot.